Hey, beautiful, please consider subscribing to our channel if you've been enjoying these stories. Your support helps a lot. Aid us in reaching our goal of 1,000 subscribers.
I stood frozen in the doorway watching my 90-year-old grandmother clutch her chest while two people in HOA jackets shoved a folded piece of paper into her trembling hands. My heart punched against my ribs as I sprinted across the porch, knocking over a ceramic planter in the process. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted as I grabbed the paper from them. The taller one smirked, while the shorter woman with sharp blonde hair and a pinched face pointed to the letter official. "Notice of eviction," she said without a hint of shame. I stared at her in disbelief. "You can't evict her. She doesn't even belong to your stupid HOA. My grandmother whispered my name so softly, I nearly missed it. She was pale, holding onto the armrest of her old rocking chair with knuckles white as bone. Her oxygen tank wheezed in and out like a dying animal. I turned to them again, anger boiling. "I'm calling the police and a lawyer, and you can explain this nonsense to them." They exchanged a glance. Then the woman pulled down her sunglasses with a smirk. "Call whoever you want, the paperwork is in motion. We're just following up." I watched them walk off her high heels, clicking down the porch steps like the ticks of a countdown as soon as they were out of sight. I knelt next to my grandmother and held her hand. She didn't speak right away, just kept looking down at the eviction notice. "I didn't think it would come to this," she finally whispered. I took the letter and crumpled it in two. "My pocket." "Don't worry, Grandma, I won't let them take your home." Her home, a little yellow bungalow with chipped paint and a wind chime she made herself 30 years ago. The front yard had her rose bushes wild and fragrant, a porch swing faded from decades of sun. This house wasn't just four walls and a roof. It was her memory, her identity, her whole life in photo frames and teacups and hand-stitched blankets. And now this HOA was trying to erase her with a form and a signature. I sat with her for a long while, letting her recover. The afternoon sun leaned down over the porch like a watchful dog, and the wind smelled faintly of lavender. I hated that I noticed it, because things this beautiful always end too soon. When I finally stood up, I called my mom, then our family lawyer, then the local housing authority. None of them had answers I liked, and all of them confirmed the same thing. Legally, she was not under HOA jurisdiction. The association had formed only 10 years ago, and when it did, Grandma had opted out and registered her property as independent from the organization. But this woman? This Karen, yes. Her name was actually Karen Eldridge. Newly elected HOA president, self-righteous power. Hungry and smug enough to run a private empire. If she could get her hands on one, she moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago, bought the biggest house on the block, then immediately began remodeling and hosting HOA meetings that felt more like corporate summits. She'd pushed out 2 other families already. One left willingly, the other sold after months of pressure and harassment. Her goal was simple: make this neighborhood a model of perfect compliance and modern aesthetics, and Grandma, with her pastel curtains and wind chimes and wild roses, didn't fit the vision. Karen had tried being polite at first. A basket of cookies and a little brochure. Then the notes began. Fines for lawn violations. Complaints about the vintage mailbox, warnings about non-regulation window shutters. We ignored them at first. Then we replied by certified mail, reminding them Grandma was not part of the HOA and had legal documentation to prove it. That's when Karen turned nasty. She sent official-looking letters with fake headers, threatened liens, told neighbors that Grandma was a squatter living without property rights. We thought ignoring her would make her go away. Instead, she escalated, which brought us to today. After making some calls and gathering paperwork, I decided to visit Karen in person. Her house sat at the edge of the neighborhood, towering white stone with blue shutters and a ridiculous fountain out front that spit water like a hiccuping toad. I rang the bell and braced myself. Karen answered in a silk blouse and gold earrings, sipping lemon. "Water?" like she had been expecting a guest. She smiled without warmth. "Let me guess you're here about your grandmother." I nodded and held out the stack of papers. "She's not part of your HOA and never has been. You're harassing an elderly woman who's lived in that home longer than you've been alive." Karen took the papers, glanced at them, and then tossed them onto a nearby bench. "That area is under community development review. We're simply ensuring all properties comply with upcoming zoning plans." I stared at her. "That doesn't give you the right to trespass, intimidate, or issue fake evictions." She tilted her head and smiled wider. "Look, I understand it's hard for some people to let go, but change is coming whether you like it or not." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a purr. "Maybe it's time she moved into assisted living anyway. Wouldn't that be safer for everyone?" I felt my hands curl into fists. "She's 90, not dead, and she's not moving an inch." Karen sipped her lemon water again. "Suit yourself," she said, then shut the door in my face. I drove home fuming. The audacity, the arrogance, the total lack of empathy. She saw my grandmother as a blemish on her community image, a wrinkle in her polished plan, but I knew better. Grandma was the heart of that street, the one who watched over everyone's kids, baked cookies for school events, watered the neighbors' plants when they were out of town. I remembered being 6 years old and watching fireflies in her backyard. She had built that home with Grandpa back when the neighborhood was just gravel roads and wooden fences, and now this self-important newcomer wanted to wipe that all away for the sake of uniformity and curb appeal when I pulled into Grandma's driveway. The sun was low and golden. She sat on the porch again, wrapped in a shawl, her tea untouched beside her. I joined her quietly. We watched the light stretch across the roses as cicadas began to hum. "She wants me gone," Grandma said softly. "She doesn't get to decide that?" I replied. She looked at me with tired eyes. "I'm not strong like I used to be." I reached out and held her hand. "Then I'll be strong for both of us." In that moment, something inside me settled into place. This wasn't just about paperwork or property lines. This was about justice, about dignity, about not letting bullies win just because they smiled while they stabbed you. I didn't know exactly how I was going to fight back. But I knew one thing for certain. Karen Eldridge had picked the wrong family to mess with, and I was about to show her just how bad that mistake would be. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with Grandma's legal documents spread across the faded, checkered tablecloth while she quietly stirred sugar into her tea like it was any ordinary day. But nothing about this was ordinary. I had barely slept, spending half the night researching property law, community development codes, and any possible loophole the HOA might try to exploit. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Karen was bluffing. Legally, she had no power over Grandma's house, but she didn't need power when she could manufacture fear. That was her real weapon. I needed one of my own. I made calls to a local housing advocate, a friend of mine who worked at City Hall, and even the neighborhood's original land surveyor. What I uncovered made my blood run cold. Karen wasn't just bluffing, she was planning something. According to a proposal filed 2 weeks prior, the HOA had submitted a zoning adjustment request that included Grandma's lot, even though it wasn't technically. Under their control, they claimed it was part of the natural expansion perimeter for a new community center. If approved, the zoning board could forcibly buy out the land. It wouldn't stand in court, but it could tie us up in legal battles for months, maybe years. And in that time, Karen would have full license to harass, pressure, and threaten Grandma until she gave in. I sat back staring at the ceiling as the weight of it all sank in. I couldn't let that happen. That afternoon, I attended the HOA meeting uninvited. Karen had rented out a small conference room in a local hotel. It was absurd seeing her perched at the head of the table like a monarch surrounded by smiling neighbors, sipping sparkling water and nodding obediently when I walked. In the room went quiet. Karen didn't even flinch. She just folded her hands like a headmistress ready to scold a misbehaving student. "If it isn't our neighborhood activist," she said dryly. I took a seat and ignored the glares. This is a private meeting, someone muttered. But I didn't care. I have a right to be here. You're discussing changes that affect my grandmother's property. Karen's smile was thin. As we've explained in prior communications, all future development is for the betterment of the community. Except she's not part of your community and never signed on to your HOA, I said. Karen tilted her head. She benefits from our improvements. Does she not upgraded sidewalk, street maintenance, security patrols? She pays her taxes and follows city ordinances. That's all she owes you. A murmur spread across the room. Karen's eyes narrowed, but she kept her voice level. If she doesn't wish to comply, we may be forced to consider legal remedies. I pulled out my phone and began. Recording? You mean harassment, intimidation, and fake eviction notices because I have proof of all of that? Someone in the back shifted uncomfortably. Karen laughed, but it sounded forced. That's quite the accusation. And the zoning proposal to annex her lot without consent. I added. That got a few gasps. Karen's expression didn't crack, but I saw her fingers clench slightly on the table. You're welcome to take your concerns to the board, she said with icy calm. I already have, I replied, and City Hall is very interested in why an HOA is filing expansion plans without resident consent. Silence dropped over the room. After a moment, Karen stood. This meeting is adjourned, she said, and walked out without looking back. I left too heart-racing, but victorious. For the first time, I saw her mask slip. She wasn't untouchable. She was calculating and desperate and now a little afraid, but I wasn't finished. The next day, I helped Grandma write a formal cease and desist letter citing harassment and trespassing. We mailed it with tracking and copied the city. I also contacted a local reporter I knew from college. He worked for a small paper but loved a good David versus Goliath story. By the following week, a headline ran across the community. Section: 90-year-old woman fights. HO bullying campaign. It featured photos of Grandma in her garden holding her rescue cat, smiling in front of her roses. Karen was quoted only briefly and came off cold and evasive. Neighbors started talking. People, who'd once been silent, now offered quiet support. A few even confessed to feeling pressured by Karen, but too afraid to speak up. That changed everything. Karen responded with a newsletter full of passive-aggressive statements about non-compliance and the importance of uniformity, but the damage was done. The facade cracked. 2 families refused to pay their HOA dues, citing unlawful targeting. 1 woman rescinded her board application entirely. Karen doubled down. She began walking past Grandma's house twice a day, taking photos. She stood outside for long stretches, scribbling in a notebook, pretending to make observations. It was blatant psychological warfare. So I set up security cameras. Every time Karen trespassed, I logged it. Every time she left notes, I kept them. It became a game won. She thought she could win through intimidation. But the more she pushed, the more evidence I gathered. I visited City Hall again, with everything organized in labeled folders. The clerk raised her eyebrows at the stack. This is a case waiting to explode, she said, and promised to escalate it to the compliance office. Later that week, I was leaving Grandma's house when a police cruiser pulled into the driveway. I felt my stomach drop. Karen stood beside it. Smug arms crossed, clipboard in hand. The officer stepped out calm but curious. We received a report of unsafe conditions on the property, he said. Karen smiled sweetly. There are potential code violations, exposed pipes, electrical hazards, broken steps. The officer walked up the porch, looked around, and blinked. It was spotless. Grandma had kept it pristine for years, and I had just repainted the trim myself 2 days ago. I stood with my arms folded as he inspected the walkway, the railing, even the rows. Bushes looks fine to me, he said, and Karen's face twitched. She pointed to the mailbox. That's not standard. The officer shrugged. Vintage but legal. I almost laughed. Karen fumed but said nothing. as the officer thanked us and drove off. That night, Grandma and I sat on the porch again, watching fireflies. She looked at me, her eyes full of quiet pride. "You always were stubborn," she said. I smiled. I learned from the best, but I wasn't finished yet. I had one more card to play, because while Karen thought she was running the neighborhood, she had no idea what was coming next. And I couldn't wait to watch her perfect little kingdom crumble brick by brick, especially when the very rules she clung to turned against her in full view of everyone. She tried so hard to impress. The morning sun spilled through the blinds as I sipped black coffee, scrolling through the HOA website again for the 100th time. There it was, buried in the fine print on the last page of the Bylaws Clause 9 section. 4. Any board member found abusing their position for personal gain or engaging in behavior that brings disrepute to the organization may be subject to immediate removal, following a vote by active members with evidence submitted to the Oversight Committee. I stared at those words as an idea sparked, fully formed and sharp. It was time to turn Karen's kingdom against her. I printed everything. Every note she left on Grandma's door. Every email she sent threatening legal action. Every time-stamped photo from the security camera showing her trespassing. Even the video of her walking onto Grandma's lawn at night holding a clipboard and flashlight like she was some kind of suburban detective. Then I drafted a formal petition for her removal. It had to be worded perfectly, professional, respectful, and rooted in their own rules. The beauty of it was she'd spent so long preaching about order and decorum. Now those same values would be her undoing. Over the next few days, I went door to door. Some people slammed their doors the moment they saw me, but others listened. I didn't plead or rant. I just showed them the truth. Photos, documents, a copy of the zoning request. I told them what Karen had tried to do to my grandma, how she had manipulated the system to push out someone who had lived there longer than the HOA had even existed. Slowly the signatures came in. One neighbor who never spoke a word waved me into her kitchen and signed without asking questions. Another man who'd been fined 3 times for painting his fence slightly off-white laughed out loud as he signed. The petition reached 25 names in 2 days. By the end of the week, it had 34, enough to trigger a formal review. I sent everything in a sealed packet to the Oversight Committee. They were a group of retired attorneys and former city officials who lived 2 neighborhoods over. They didn't care about gossip. They cared about liability. And Karen had become a walking lawsuit. I waited. Then 2 days later, an announcement popped up on the HOA message. Board Emergency Special Session to review complaints against Board President Karen Miller. Mandatory attendance encouraged, documentation to be presented. I almost danced in the living room. When the day arrived, I dressed in a pressed shirt slacks and carried 3 copies of everything. Grandma gave me a quick kiss on the cheek as I left her porch. "You've got this," she said, and I smiled. The meeting was held in the same sterile hotel room as before, but the mood was different. This time, whispers rippled across the room as I walked in. Karen stood near the front, stiffly talking to another board member, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. I sat in the front row facing the long table where the Oversight Committee would sit. At exactly 6 p.m., 3 elderly individuals walked in wearing name tags and calm expressions. They sat without small talk and called the meeting to order. Karen stood when asked. She spoke first. Her tone was smooth. She said she had acted within the authority granted to her by the board, that she was merely enforcing community standards, that she regretted any misunderstanding and welcomed a transparent review. She handed them a binder full of documents. Then it was my turn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. Presented. I laid out the timeline, the harassment, the false notices, the zoning proposal, the trespassing, the psychological pressure tactics. I played the video of her creeping onto my grandmother's lawn at 11:30 p.m., holding a flashlight, gasps. Even, the oversight chair leaned forward. I finished by placing the petition on the table. 34 signatures from active members, all demanding her removal. The silence afterward was heavy. Karen's face was pale now, but her voice still held steel. These claims are exaggerated and taken out of context. The oversight chair folded his hands. Regardless, you violated several protocols, including privacy encroachment and unilateral action on a zoning request. Karen's jaw tensed. This is a witch hunt. No, the chair said. This is accountability. The vote took less than 10 minutes. Karen Miller removed as board president, effective immediately. When the result was read, she stood frozen for half a beat. Then she grabbed her bag and stormed out. But that wasn't the end, because karma still had one more card to play. I walked out into the parking lot, breathing the cool air like I hadn't in weeks. But just as I reached my car, I saw flashing lights turn the corner. A police cruiser rolled up and parked beside Karen's BMW. She was standing near her trunk on her phone when the officer stepped out. Her voice rose as she protested something, but he stayed calm and firm. I stood still, heart pounding. Another cruiser pulled in, one of the officers, walked over to me. Are you the one who filed the trespassing logs and video evidence last month? I nodded. He smiled slightly. You helped a lot more than you know. We had 3 other residents come forward after that article ran, Karen's voice snapped through the air. This is insane. I was protecting property values. You were harassing a 90-year-old woman, the officer said as he pulled out handcuffs. Gasps echoed around the parking lot as people gathered. Phones came out, cameras rolled. Karen sputtered, demanded to speak to someone higher up, but it didn't matter. She was led into the back of the cruiser. The last thing I saw was her stunned face through the tinted window as it pulled away. Someone clapped behind me. A slow, deliberate clap. It was the old man from Unit 6 who Karen had once fined for putting garden gnomes on his lawn. He nodded once and walked away grinning. I drove home in a daze, not just from victory, but from the sheer poetic justice of it all. When I pulled into Grandma's driveway, she was already on the porch smiling with 2 mugs of tea waiting. She's gone, I said. I know. Grandma replied and handed me a mug. The tea was sweet and warm and perfect. We sat in silence watching the sun sink behind the trees. But I knew the story wasn't over just yet, because when someone builds their power on fear and manipulation, the fall always leaves cracks, and I intended to make sure none of those cracks ever let her slither back in again. The morning after Karen's arrest felt quieter than usual. Birdsong drifted lazily through the open kitchen window, and Grandma hummed softly as she arranged fresh flowers in the vase by the sink. But there was something in the air, a shift, like the whole neighborhood had exhaled. People waved a little longer from their porches. Someone had chalked a heart on the sidewalk in front of Grandma's house with the words, "Welcome home, Queen." I couldn't help but smile, but I wasn't done. See Karen's arrest wasn't the end. It was just the crumbling of a facade, and underneath that broken surface were deeper roots of her influence that still lingered like rot. The HOA had a new interim president, Mrs. Redmond, a stern former librarian with iron posture, and a love for bylaws. She wasn't evil, but she wasn't brave either. I attended the next board meeting just to observe. It was stiff and oddly quiet. Without Karen's shrill authority echoing off the walls, I brought Grandma with me. She wore her Sunday best and sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. People whispered when she walked in. Some smiled sheepishly. Others looked away, guilt mixed with respect. That was the start of something. During the public comment portion, Grandma stood. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. She thanked the board for taking action, but then she said, "This community is only as strong as the compassion we show our neighbors." That silenced the room. Then she sat down again. That night, someone left a pie on our doorstep. No note, just warm and still smelling of cinnamon. 2 days later, a letter came addressed to Grandma from the county zoning office. It stated the proposal submitted by Karen Miller regarding rezoning and the subsequent eviction request had been permanently rejected. There would be no appeal process. She was blacklisted from filing property-related motions for 5 years. I framed that letter and hung it in the hallway, and for a while life settled. But then the viral video happened. Someone had uploaded the footage of Karen being cuffed in the parking lot. It had been edited perfectly. The slow clap, the stunned look on her face, a dramatic soundtrack by the end of the week. It had 4 million views. Then 10, then 20, I started seeing memes Karen screaming. In all caps, Karen trying to evict the elderly, Karen with devil horns drawn in. She became the internet's latest cautionary tale. Even late-night talk shows made jokes. Tonight's HOA horror story features Karen, who tried to evict a 90-year-old woman and ended up evicting herself straight into jail. It was glorious, but it also triggered something unexpected. Karen tried to sue the HOA claiming wrongful removal, defamation, emotional distress. But the oversight committee had her original proposals, her emails, her late-night visits recorded by multiple residents. Her lawsuit was thrown out. Then she tried a local news interview to clear her name, but the anchor hit her with facts, video evidence, sworn statements. It aired live. And by the end, even the anchor was raising an eyebrow at her spiraling justifications. Her reputation was ash. She tried to move to another community, but they rejected her application once her name popped up. Grandma and I watched that news segment over tea. She chuckled. That woman lit the match, and now she's choking on the smoke. I leaned back and sighed. Poetic justice, but it wasn't over. One morning, Grandma got a call. It was a lawyer. Apparently, Karen had named her in a small claims case. Of course she did. She claimed Grandma caused her undue emotional damage and personal losses by orchestrating a campaign of humiliation. We both laughed, but I still showed up at court with a binder. Again, Karen walked in wearing oversized sunglasses and a bitter frown. She looked older, worn down, but her voice still tried to hold authority. The judge glanced over her documents, then looked at me. I calmly placed our binder on the table and handed the judge a flash drive. Inside was everything again: the video, the petition, Karen's, emails, even footage from the HOA meeting showing her public meltdown. The judge barely said 10 words before tossing out the case. Then he said, "Ms. Miller, you may want to consider counseling, not courtrooms." I almost laughed. Karen stormed out again, pattern. Recognition, but this time I didn't feel triumphant. I felt closure, real finality, like a weight had lifted and drifted off with her as we left the courthouse. I looked at Grandma. She was smiling faintly, but her eyes were focused. "Let's do something. For the neighborhood," she said. "A garden, maybe?" I blinked. "A community garden." She nodded. "Something people can share and take pride in, something that grows." That weekend, we started planning, and by the next month, the lot behind the clubhouse was cleared, fenced, and planted with help from a dozen volunteers. People brought seeds, compost, hand tools. They came together like they had been waiting for a reason. Even Mrs. Redmond got her hands dirty. Kids painted signs. Elderly folks brought benches, and when the first sprigs of green broke, the soil people clapped. I caught it all on video and posted it. It got shared by a local Food Network blog, then picked up by a community resilience site. One comment said, "This is what HOAs should be about. Not power trips, but people," and I couldn't agree more. One evening, just before dusk, I walked with Grandma along the garden path. We watched the tomatoes swelling on the vine, the herbs curling toward the sky, the bees bouncing lazily between blossoms. She reached out and gently touched a leaf. "Funny, isn't it?" she said. "What?" I asked. "How something so small like a letter in the mail or a knock on the door can start an avalanche." I nodded slowly, and how sometimes avalanches clear the path. She smiled and leaned on her cane. "I'm proud of you." That hit deep. I had done all of this to protect her, but in the process, I had changed too. Found courage, found purpose, and I had turned something ugly into something beautiful. The final twist came months later. A letter arrived in a plain envelope. It was from Karen. Just a few lines scrawled in tight, angry handwriting, no apology, just blame bitterness, and a final statement. You think you won, but you destroyed my life? I showed it too. Grandma, she read it, folded it carefully, and tossed it into the compost bin. Let her rot into something useful for once, she said. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. We stood there in the soft glow of evening, surrounded by green and gold and the low hum of summer insects. Karen was gone, but her legacy had been rewritten, not by hate, not by power, not by fear, but by people choosing to stand together, choosing to protect what mattered, choosing to grow instead of control. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all, because empires built on fear crumble, but communities built on kindness, they bloom forever.